Before anything here was ever called a city, the ground was already hiding it. 9,000 years ago, something was built in a place that no longer matches any modern landscape we recognize today. Not a ruin on the surface, not a forgotten temple half exposed by wind or desert, but an entire settlement, sealed so completely beneath layers of earth that its existence vanished from human memory itself. And when it was finally found, it didn't behave like a single discovery. It behaved like a timeline collapsed into stone cities built, erased, rebuilt again, each layer rewriting what came before. What you're about to see is not just archaeology. It's a slow return into a world that kept itself buried for reasons we still don't fully understand. Before we go deeper into this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps support more long-form mysteries like this and keeps this kind of forgotten history alive. Because beneath this ground, the past isn't over. It's still waiting. The wind moves across the empty ground like it has nowhere else to go. It drags fine grains of sand and dust over a landscape that, at first glance, appears completely lifeless. No walls, no roads, no signs of human intention break the horizon. Only subtle variations in colour beneath the surface hint that something lies hidden below. Something older than memory, older than any written account that survives today. Beneath this quiet desert or dry basin, layers of earth press down on what once may have been a living, breathing city sealed away for nearly 9,000 years, forgotten not because it was insignificant, but because time itself buried it too deeply for a chance to reveal. It begins, as so many discoveries do, with something that should not have been there. A survey team working across a remote, eroded basin notices an irregular pattern in the ground's resistance. Satellite scans suggest subtle geometric anomalies beneath the surface, too structured to be natural rock formations, too large to be modern disturbance. At first, it is dismissed as sediment noise, a trick of mineral density or ancient river deposition, but repeated readings sharpen the pattern. Straight lines appear where nature prefers curves. Angles form where erosion should have erased intention entirely. Before long, excavation begins. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The first excavation cuts are modest, almost cautious, as if the ground itself might object to being disturbed. Soil is removed in controlled layers, revealing compacted earth that behaves differently from the surrounding terrain. It does not crumble as expected for untouched sediment. Instead, it resists, holding shape in a way that suggests compression from above, not natural accumulation. Then, at a depth that defies initial predictions, the texture changes again. Stones appear, arranged too deliberately to be random geological drift. A corner emerges, not the corner of a natural formation, but something sharply defined, aligned with an intention that has not been present in this landscape for millennia. The edges are too straight, too precise. The surface stones show signs of shaping, subtle but unmistakable. Even before full exposure, the implication becomes difficult to ignore. This is not a scattered ruin or isolated structure. It is part of something larger, something organized, something once inhabited. As more soil is removed, the outline expands into a structure whose scale begins to shift perception itself. Walls emerge, running in parallel lines, intersecting at angles that suggest planned architecture rather than accidental stacking. The stones are not uniform, yet they fit together in a way that implies knowledge of balance and weight distribution. In some sections, clay-like material binds them together, hardened by time into something almost indistinguishable from rock. The deeper the excavation goes, the clearer it becomes that this structure is not alone. Adjacent shapes appear, partially connected, forming what may once have been a network of rooms or courtyards. The layout suggests repetition, order, and a degree of sophistication unexpected for anything this old. If the preliminary dating is correct, this settlement predates the earliest known urban centres by thousands of years. That possibility alone forces hesitation. Archaeology is cautious by nature, and extraordinary claims demand extraordinary verification. Yet the evidence continues to accumulate layer by layer, indifferent to skepticism. Then comes the first artifact, a small object, buried just beneath a collapsed section of wall, emerges coated in mineral deposits. It is shaped with intention, smoothed along edges that suggest use rather than decoration. Its function is not immediately clear, but it does not resemble random stone fragmentation. Nearby, another object appears, then another, each placed in a way that suggests they were once part of everyday life, rather than ceremonial deposition. Tools, fragments of containers, and what may be remnants of woven materials preserved in mineral traces begin to form a pattern of domestic existence. What makes the discovery more unsettling is not just its age, but its completeness. This is not a scatter of relics transported by water or wind. It is a context, a frozen environment, as if a moment of human activity was sealed and then forgotten by geological time. As excavation expands outward, the boundaries of the site begin to take shape. It is larger than initially expected, far larger. What was thought to be a single structure now reveals itself as part of a broader settlement pattern. Linear alignments suggest streets or passageways. Open spaces hint at gathering areas. The organization implies not a temporary encampment, but a stable, long-term habitation with planning, resource management, and social structure. And yet, something does not align with established timelines. The accepted narrative of human development places complex settlement formation within a much later period, 9,000 years ago. Human societies in many regions are generally understood to be transitioning from mobile hunter-gatherer groups toward early agriculture, not constructing structured urban environments. That's why the implications of this site are so difficult to absorb. It does not fit neatly into existing frameworks. It stretches them, distorts them, forces questions that do not yet have stable answers. The soil itself adds another layer of complexity. Sediment analysis suggests repeated inundation events, cycles of deposition that may have slowly entombed the settlement. But the pattern is irregular. In some layers, material appears to have been rapidly deposited, almost violently, while others suggest slow accumulation over long periods. This inconsistency raises a possibility that cannot yet be confirmed that the burial of this city was not a single event, but a series of transformations that gradually erased it from visibility. In the distance, beyond the excavation trench, the landscape remains unchanged, empty, silent, indifferent. It is difficult to reconcile what lies beneath with what stands above. One is a structured human past, complex and deliberate. The other is a present stripped of visible memory. The contrast creates a kind of temporal fracture, as if two worlds are occupying the same space but cannot see each other. As the work continues, researchers begin to speak cautiously about what they are seeing. Words like unexpected, early complexity, and anomalous stratigraphy appear in preliminary notes, but beneath the formal language is something harder to disguise: uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of small gaps in data, but the deeper uncertainty that comes when a model of history begins to bend under new pressure. Still, no one yet claims certainty about what this place truly is. Not a city, at least not yet in confirmed terms, not a civilization, at least not officially, but the architecture, the artifacts, and the sheer scale of what is emerging make neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. And so the excavation continues, each layer of earth removed not just revealing the past, but challenging the assumptions of what the past was capable of becoming. Deep below the surface, where light has not reached for thousands of years, the outline of something human-made waits patiently to be fully uncovered, as if it has been expecting this moment far longer than those now digging above it. The excavation expands slowly, not because of difficulty alone, but because of hesitation. Every new exposed surface forces a recalibration of expectations. What was once thought to be a single buried structure now behaves like a fragment of something far larger, something that extends beyond the initial survey grid. The ground no longer feels like empty sediment waiting to be cleared. It feels layered with intention, as if the landscape itself had once been reorganized and then deliberately erased. As the soil is peeled back in controlled sections, the geometry beneath becomes clearer. Walls align with one another in ways that suggest planning across distance, not isolated construction. What appears in one trench is mirrored faintly in another, as though the settlement was designed with repeating structural logic. This is not the irregular clustering typical of early semi-nomadic habitation. It carries the imprint of coordination, of shared design principles maintained across multiple building phases. Yet nothing about its age should allow for this level of coherence. The deeper layers present an even more difficult problem. Beneath the first architectural stratum lies another, slightly offset, as if an earlier version of the settlement existed below the one first uncovered. This layering is not the result of later rebuilding in the conventional sense. The alignment between levels is too deliberate, too consistent. It suggests continuity across generations, or possibly reconstruction following a partial burial event. In either case, the implication is unsettling. This place may have been built, lost, and built again before finally being sealed entirely. The soil composition changes again as excavation proceeds. Fine silts dominate, interspersed with coarser deposits that appear to have been carried by water. These layers are not uniform. Some are compact and compressed, indicating long-term settlement under pressure. Others are chaotic, containing mixed material that seems to have been rapidly deposited. This irregular stratigraphy suggests that whatever buried the city did not act in a single uniform event. Instead, it may have involved repeated environmental disruptions, each contributing to the gradual concealment of the site. Within this shifting geological record, more artifacts begin to emerge. Unlike the initial finds, which suggested domestic activity, these objects hint at specialization. Sharpened stone implements appear in clusters, some arranged near what may have been workshop areas. Fragments of pigment-stained surfaces suggest the presence of symbolic or decorative practices. Small carved objects, too regular to be accidental, raise questions about social or ritual behavior. None of these items are individually extraordinary, but together they form a pattern that suggests a society with distinct roles, skills, and possibly even early forms of craft specialization. One of the more striking discoveries comes from a partially collapsed structure near what may have been a central open space. Here, the ground reveals traces of repeated use layers of compacted soil, interspersed with ash-like residue. It suggests controlled fire activity, perhaps cooking, heating, or material processing. The distribution of these residues implies sustained occupation rather than temporary use. The space appears to have functioned as a communal area, a place where daily life converged. And yet, despite these increasingly familiar signs of human activity, the timeline remains deeply disorienting. Radiometric samples taken from surrounding organic residues consistently point to a period roughly 9,000 years before present. This places the settlement in a time when many regions of the world are still defined by early transitional societies, not fully established urban systems. The implications are carefully avoided in formal reports, but the tension is unavoidable. Either the understanding of early human development is incomplete in a significant way, or this site represents an isolated and previously unknown trajectory of social complexity. In the field, interpretation remains cautious. Archaeologists avoid language that might imply conclusions too quickly. Instead, they focus on description wall thickness, soil composition, artifact distribution. But even within this restraint, a pattern is emerging that is difficult to ignore. This was not a marginal or transient settlement. It was structured, sustained, and spatially organized in a way that suggests long-term habitation. As excavation continues outward, the settlement boundary begins to blur. What initially appeared to be a contained site now reveals extensions that stretch beyond the primary excavation zone. Linear depressions in the ground suggest pathways or roads that once connected different parts of the settlement. These features are faint but persistent, detectable through subtle variations in soil density. In some areas, stone fragments appear aligned in parallel rows, hinting at structures that may have once bordered these routes. The scale of the settlement begins to expand in the imagination of the researchers. It is no longer a single buried city block or isolated cluster of buildings. It is increasingly being interpreted as a networked environment, possibly with districts or functional zones, residential areas, communal spaces, and working areas may have existed in relation to one another, forming a coherent spatial system. Still, one question grows more pressing with each new discovery: how could such a system have existed so early? And why does it leave so little trace in surrounding regions? No comparable settlements from the same period have been identified nearby with similar complexity. This isolation deepens the mystery. If this was part of a broader cultural system, where are the other sites? If it was unique, what conditions allowed it to emerge here and nowhere else? The environmental context begins to offer partial clues. Pollen analysis from deeper sediment layers suggest that the region was once significantly wetter, possibly supporting vegetation that no longer exists in the modern landscape. River channels, now dry or deeply altered, appear to have once flowed closer to the settlement. These waterways may have provided the necessary conditions for sustained habitation, agriculture, or resource gathering. But environmental support alone does not explain the architectural coherence or the apparent scale of organization. In one section of the excavation, a particularly dense cluster of structural remains draws attention. Here, walls intersect at consistent angles, forming enclosed spaces that appear more deliberate than others. Within these spaces, artifacts are more concentrated, suggesting areas of higher activity or importance. The layout hints at hierarchy, not necessarily in the modern sense of social stratification, but in functional differentiation. Some spaces seem designed for production, others for gathering, and some possibly for storage or coordination. Yet even as patterns emerge, contradictions persist. Certain layers show signs of abrupt disruption. Walls appear collapsed in a manner inconsistent with slow decay. Floors are covered by sudden sediment deposits that do not match gradual environmental accumulation. These anomalies suggest episodes of rapid change, possibly catastrophic in nature, flooding, seismic activity, or sudden environmental shifts remain among the possibilities being considered, though none fully account for the complexity of the burial process observed across the site. As the day ends and excavation tools are set aside, the exposed sections of the city remain partially revealed, like fragments of a story interrupted mid-sentence. The structures do not feel abandoned in the usual sense of gradual decline. Instead, they feel interrupted, as if something external altered the trajectory of life here before it could complete its natural course. And beneath all of it, still unexposed layers remain, waiting. Layers that may hold the explanation or deepen the uncertainty even further. The deeper the excavation goes, the more the ground begins to behave less like empty earth and more like a compressed archive of interrupted time. Each layer peeled away reveals not just structures, but decisions, choices made by people who lived in a world that is now only partially recoverable. Beneath the upper architectural remains, the soil becomes denser, darker, and more compacted, as if the weight of thousands of years has turned it into a seal rather than a covering. At first, the transition is subtle. Stone foundations give way to thicker, more embedded construction, where walls are no longer simply placed upon the earth, but anchored into it. The builders of this buried city appear to have understood stability in a way that goes beyond simple stacking or arrangement. Stones are fitted into trenches cut into the ground itself, then packed with clay and fine sediment that has since hardened into a near geological bond. This method suggests experience, repetition, and accumulated knowledge passed across generations. But what lies beneath these foundations introduces a deeper complication. Another layer appears, not a continuation of the same city phase, but something earlier, slightly shifted in orientation. The alignment of walls changes by a few degrees, enough to indicate a different construction logic, perhaps even a different planning authority or cultural phase. This is not uncommon in ancient settlements that evolve over time, but the depth at which this second phase appears is what challenges expectations. It suggests that human occupation here was not only long but structurally complex across deep time, far earlier than comparable sites in surrounding regions. The sediment between these layers contains traces of waterborne material. Fine silt mixed with organic debris suggests periods when the area was submerged, or at least heavily influenced by seasonal flooding. Yet the deposits are not uniform. Some layers show calm accumulation, while others appear violently disturbed, as if large volumes of water arrived suddenly and then receded just as quickly. This alternating pattern raises questions about environmental instability rather than steady climatic conditions. Within this deeper stratum, artifacts become more sparse but more revealing. Stone tools appear that differ subtly from those found in upper layers. The craftsmanship remains consistent in skill, but the form evolves. Edges are more refined, shapes more specialized. Some tools appear designed for repetitive tasks rather than general use, suggesting increasing labor differentiation. This shift is often associated with societies moving toward more complex organization, where roles begin to separate and knowledge becomes specialized rather than universal. Even more intriguing are fragments of material that are not easily classified. Mineral-stained pieces of what may have once been organic containers appear in compressed clusters. Some bear impressions of woven textures, preserved only as ghost-like patterns in sediment. These traces suggest storage systems perhaps for grain, liquids, or processed materials. The presence of storage implies planning beyond immediate survival, indicating foresight and possibly surplus management, a key step in the development of early structured societies. But alongside these signs of complexity, there are inconsistencies that resist simple interpretation. In several excavation points, the deeper layer appears abruptly truncated. Cultural material vanishes without gradual transition, replaced instead by sterile sediment that shows little evidence of human activity. It is as if occupation ends suddenly, not through slow abandonment but through a break in continuity. Above this sterile layer, human occupation resumes in a slightly altered form, suggesting either reoccupation after an interruption or rebuilding following a disruptive event. The nature of that interruption remains unclear. Some researchers cautiously propose environmental collapse. Others consider the possibility of repeated flooding cycles that periodically erased habitation zones. A smaller group suggests tectonic activity, though there is limited direct seismic evidence preserved in the immediate stratigraphy. What remains consistent across interpretations is the sense that this settlement experienced not a single life cycle, but multiple phases of disruption and recovery. As excavation spreads outward, the architecture beneath the earliest confirmed city phase becomes more irregular. Walls here are less standardized, sometimes curved rather than straight, and constructed with more variation in stone size. This could indicate an earlier developmental stage, where building techniques were still evolving. Yet even in this less formal arrangement, there is still intention. Structures are not random. They cluster in patterns that suggest functional grouping, perhaps seasonal habitation zones or early forms of communal organization. The ground also begins to reveal subtle traces of landscape modification. Soil composition changes in ways that suggest human influence beyond construction. Certain areas show evidence of long-term compaction consistent with repeated foot traffic. Others contain altered sediment layers that may have been intentionally leveled or reinforced. There are even faint indications of possible water management channels or depressions that could have guided seasonal runoff, if confirmed. This would suggest an understanding of environmental control far earlier than expected for this period. Yet the most striking discovery of this layer is not architectural or environmental, but spatial. The settlement appears to have been oriented around a central axis, not strictly in a geometric sense, but in a functional one. Key structures align toward a shared point of reference, possibly a natural feature that has since disappeared. It may have been a river bend, a spring, or even a landscape formation that held cultural or practical significance. Whatever it was, it no longer exists in the modern terrain, leaving only the architectural echo of its importance. This absence creates a disconnection between past and present geography. The city is no longer anchored to the world that shaped it. Its reference points have vanished, leaving only internal logic preserved in stone. As more layers are exposed, the relationship between environment and settlement becomes increasingly complex. It is no longer clear whether the city adapted to its landscape or whether the landscape itself shifted around the city over time. Geological data suggests both may be true at different moments, with gradual environmental change overlaid by sudden disruptive events. And still, beneath this already ancient phase, deeper strata remain untouched. There is a growing awareness among the excavation team that what they are uncovering may not be a single city in the conventional sense, but a sequence of human occupations layered across time, each partially erasing and rebuilding what came before. This transforms the site from a static discovery into something far more dynamic, a palimpsest of human presence stretched across thousands of years, compressed into a single vertical column of earth. Every removal of soil is no longer just exposure of the past. It is the unfolding of multiple pasts, stacked, interrupted, and partially forgotten. And below it all, the earliest traces still wait, sealed in silence that predates even the first clear outline of the city itself. The excavation reaches a point where the soil itself begins to change character again, not just in colour or density, but in behaviour. It compacts differently under pressure, holding moisture in irregular pockets that suggest ancient water movement long since vanished from the region. The deeper layers feel less like settled ground and more like a rewritten landscape, one that has been compressed, reshaped, and slowly transformed into something unrecognizable from the surface world above. At this depth, the most persistent pattern is water. Not present water, but its memory preserved in sediment. Mineral streaks trace paths that no longer exist on the modern surface. These faint signatures reveal channels that once carried flow across the region with regularity and force. Some are wide and branching, resembling river systems that would have supported sustained ecological life. Others are narrow, almost seasonal, suggesting cycles of abundance and scarcity that shaped how early inhabitants interacted with their environment. The buried city, already anomalous in its complexity, now appears increasingly tied to a vanished hydrological system. This realization reframes earlier assumptions. The settlement was not simply placed in a stable environment, it was embedded within one that no longer exists in any recognizable form. The rivers that once sustained it may have shifted course, dried out, or been redirected by gradual geological processes or sudden climatic events. The absence of these waterways in the present landscape is not just a change in scenery, but a fundamental alteration of the conditions that made the city possible in the first place. As excavation continues along what is now believed to be the central zone of occupation, the structural density increases again. Walls appear closer together, and spaces between them become more deliberately defined. This suggests a more intensified phase of habitation, possibly a period when the settlement reached its peak development. The architecture here is more consistent, with better defined boundaries between interior and exterior spaces. Some structures appear larger and more robust, possibly serving communal or administrative functions. Yet even in this apparent peak, there are signs of instability. Certain walls show evidence of repair layered over damage. Stones are reused, repositioned, and reinforced in ways that suggest ongoing maintenance under stress. Floors contain multiple resurfacing layers, indicating repeated rebuilding over time. These patterns point not to a single stable golden age, but to a society continuously adapting to changing conditions, both environmental and possibly social. Within these structures, artifact distribution becomes more concentrated and more varied. Tools are found alongside fragments of pigment and mineral residue, hinting at activities that go beyond survival. Some areas show traces of grinding or processing, possibly for food preparation or material production. Others contain clusters of small, carefully shaped objects whose function remains uncertain. The diversity of material suggests a community with multiple overlapping activities, rather than a purely subsistence-based existence. One of the most intriguing finds emerges from a partially collapsed chamber near what may have been a central thoroughfare. Here, the sediment preserves faint impressions of vertical structures, post holes, or support bases that indicate wooden or organic architecture once stood above the stone foundations. Though the organic material has long since decayed, the negative space it left behind allows a reconstruction of form. It suggests that not all structures in the city were stone. Many may have been built from perishable materials, making the visible ruins only a fraction of what once existed. This raises an important possibility. The apparent simplicity of the archaeological record may be misleading. If much of the city was constructed from materials that do not preserve well over millennia, then what is visible today could represent only its skeletal remains. The full complexity of the settlement may have been far greater than what stone alone can reveal. As layers are peeled back further, a new pattern begins to emerge in the spatial organization. There are repeated clusters of structures arranged in semi-regular spacing, suggesting divisions within the settlement. These could represent family units, functional groups, or early forms of neighborhood organization. Between these clusters are open areas, possibly used for gatherings, trade, or communal activities. The repetition of this pattern across the site suggests a shared underlying system of organization rather than random expansion. However, the most striking aspect of this layer is not what is present, but what is absent. There are no clear signs of defensive structures, no fortification walls, no obvious barriers, no consistent evidence of militarized architecture. For a settlement of this scale and apparent complexity, this absence is notable. It raises questions about the social conditions of the city. Was it located in a region where conflict was minimal, or did its form of organization rely on different mechanisms of cohesion that did not require physical defense? The answer is not immediately clear, but the absence itself becomes part of the puzzle. Environmental data continues to complicate interpretation. Pollen samples suggest a landscape that supported a richer ecological environment than today. Plant species no longer found in the region appear in the deeper layers, indicating a climate that was likely more humid and biologically diverse. This would have provided ample resources for sustained human habitation, reinforcing the idea that the city existed within a very different ecological context than the modern landscape. Yet even in this more favourable environment, evidence of abrupt change persists. Sediment layers show sudden shifts in composition, as though large volumes of material were deposited in relatively short periods. These could correspond to flooding events, storms, or other natural disruptions. Each event appears to have left a mark not just on the landscape, but on the settlement itself, forcing adaptation, repair, and possibly partial abandonment before reoccupation. As excavation extends deeper still, the sense of continuity begins to fracture. The city is no longer seen as a single evolving entity, but as a sequence of responses to external pressures. Growth, disruption, rebuilding, and adaptation form a repeating cycle embedded within the earth. Each cycle leaves behind traces, but none fully preserve the whole story. And beneath these cycles lies something even older, a foundation that does not yet reveal its full shape, but hints at an origin point where human presence first began to organize itself into something resembling permanence. The deeper levels remain quiet, sealed beneath weight and time, holding whatever truth might explain how this place first came into being and why it ultimately disappeared beneath the shifting earth. At a certain depth, the excavation no longer feels like the removal of soil from a site, but like the slow unravelling of a system that was never meant to be seen all at once. The layers compress history so tightly that distinctions between centuries begin to blur. What should be separate episodes of human occupation begin to appear as variations of a single, long, unstable relationship between people and land. Here, the artifacts change again. The familiar domestic traces become less frequent, replaced by objects that suggest more specialized activity. Stone tools appear with refined edges, shaped not only for use but for precision. Some are too uniform to be purely handcrafted in the casual sense, suggesting repeated technique or standardized production methods. This does not imply industrial manufacturing in a modern sense, but it does hint at shared knowledge systems that were carefully transmitted and maintained. In several areas, clusters of these tools are found together, arranged not randomly but in patterns that suggest working spaces. The ground around them is darker, enriched by repeated activity, possibly from organic materials, heat exposure, or prolonged human presence. These zones begin to resemble early workshops, though the term feels too modern for what is being uncovered. What becomes more significant, however, is not the tools themselves, but what they imply about time. A society capable of producing consistent tool forms across multiple layers suggests continuity, not just occupation, but sustained cultural memory. Skills must have been taught, repeated, and preserved across generations without collapse into fragmentation. This requires stability that is difficult to reconcile with the environmental disruptions observed in surrounding strata. Yet the site continues to resist simple categorization. In some layers, the tool forms shift subtly, not enough to suggest a different civilization, but enough to indicate change over time, perhaps evolving needs, or shifting environmental pressures that demanded adaptation. The continuity is there, but it is not static. It bends rather than breaks. Deeper still, the settlement begins to show signs of intensified spatial organization. Structures appear more deliberately arranged, with clearer separation between functional areas. Some zones contain high concentrations of production debris, while others remain unusually clean, almost curated. This contrast suggests a division of space that goes beyond simple habitation. Certain areas were likely reserved for specific activities, while others may have been kept intentionally clear for movement, gathering, or symbolic purposes. The idea of organization becomes increasingly unavoidable. Even without written records, the settlement reveals a logic, not a rigid blueprint, but a lived structure of repeated human decisions that shaped space over time. Paths emerge through repeated foot traffic. Boundaries form through use rather than construction. The city, or what will later be understood as a city, is not imposed on the landscape in a single act. It accumulates like memory. Then, unexpectedly, the pattern shifts again. A layer appears where artifacts thin out sharply, not a gradual decline, but a noticeable reduction in human material. Tools become scarce, domestic traces fade, even structural debris becomes less dense. It is as if the settlement, in this phase, experienced a contraction of activity. This thinning is followed by a sterile sediment layer, a band of earth with minimal human signature. It is not entirely empty, but it lacks the density of occupation seen above and below it. This kind of layer often suggests environmental interruption, a pause in habitation, or a period of abandonment. But what makes it more striking here is what follows it. Above the sterile layer, occupation resumes, but it does not return in exactly the same form. Structures are slightly altered in orientation. Tool types shift again. Spatial organization becomes less dense, more spread out. This suggests reoccupation after disruption, rather than uninterrupted continuity. Something happened in between these phases that forced a break in settlement patterns. The question is, what kind of event could create such a clean interruption? Flooding remains a leading hypothesis in early interpretations. The presence of waterborne sediments supports this idea, especially in the lower layers. A major inundation could have temporarily rendered the area uninhabitable, forcing abandonment and later return. But the evidence is not perfectly aligned with a single catastrophic flood. Instead, it suggests variability, multiple disturbances, possibly over extended periods. Other interpretations emerge cautiously. Climatic instability, shifting river systems, or even seismic activity could produce similar patterns when combined over long durations. Each explanation accounts for parts of the evidence, but none fully resolves it. Within this uncertainty, one detail becomes increasingly important. The reoccupation layer shows greater efficiency in construction. Walls are more uniform, spacing more deliberate, and material reuse more evident. It suggests that the returning population, or successor group, had learned from previous experience. Knowledge was not lost entirely during the interruption, it was adapted. This raises a deeper implication. The site may not represent a single continuous civilization, but a sequence of culturally connected groups responding to recurring environmental conditions. Each phase builds on what came before, even after disruption. Memory, in this sense, may not be purely biological or institutional. It may be embedded in landscape familiarity, in inherited spatial awareness, in the tendency to rebuild in known locations despite risk. As excavation continues, deeper structural layers begin to reveal something unexpected. Beneath the reoccupation phase, there are traces of earlier construction that are not simply older, they are fundamentally different in character. The stones are less regular, the spatial logic is less defined, and yet they still follow patterns that indicate intentional arrangement. This suggests a long developmental arc beneath the visible history of the site. Not a sudden emergence of complexity, but a gradual accumulation across time periods that may extend far beyond initial expectations. The deeper the excavation goes, the more the settlement seems to stretch backward into prehistory, each layer adding depth not only to the city, but to the question of how early human societies organized themselves in environments that are no longer recognizable today. And still, beneath all of this, the earliest traces remain untouched, waiting in silence, sealed under weight and time, holding the beginning of a story that has only partially been told. At this depth, the earth begins to feel less like a resting place and more like a record of abrupt change. The sediment is no longer calm or evenly layered. Instead, it carries subtle distortions, as if the ground itself had been disturbed while still in motion. Thin streaks of mixed material cut through older deposits, suggesting sudden events that disrupted the slow accumulation of time. The buried city is no longer just a structure beneath the surface. It is a witness to environmental instability written directly into the soil. One of the first signs that something major shifted in this landscape comes from the composition of the deeper strata. Mineral analysis reveals changes in salinity and moisture retention, indicating that the surrounding environment did not remain stable across the occupation phases. In some layers, conditions suggest relatively stable freshwater influence. In others, the chemistry shifts dramatically, hinting at either prolonged drought, salt intrusion, or a rerouting of water sources that once defined the region. These changes are not gradual enough to suggest simple long-term climate drift. They appear uneven, interrupted, and in some cases reversed. This inconsistency forces a reconsideration of the environment the city once depended on. It was not built in a static landscape. It existed within a system that changed, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly. Rivers may have shifted course multiple times. Seasonal patterns may have become unpredictable, or larger climatic cycles may have reshaped the region in ways that were impossible to anticipate from a single generation's perspective. Within this environmental uncertainty, the architecture begins to reflect adaptation. Lower layers show increasing evidence of repair and reinforcement. Walls are thickened in certain phases, as if responding to structural stress. In some areas, foundations are rebuilt on top of older ones, slightly offset, suggesting attempts to stabilize buildings after prior damage. These modifications are not random. They indicate active responses to changing conditions, possibly in reaction to flooding, soil instability, or gradual ground movement. The city, in this sense, is not static. It is continuously adjusted to a shifting world. Yet one category of evidence stands out more than others: the sudden absence of occupation material in specific layers. These sterile bands, repeated at different depths, suggest that habitation did not simply decline in a linear fashion. Instead, it appears to have been interrupted multiple times. Each interruption is followed by partial return, as if populations left and later came back when conditions allowed. This pattern creates a rhythm in the stratigraphy: occupation, disruption, return, adaptation, over and over again. In one particularly revealing section, sediment analysis shows a sharp influx of coarse material layered directly over habitation surfaces. The composition suggests rapid deposition, likely from high-energy water movement. This is not the slow accumulation of seasonal flooding. It appears more sudden, more forceful, capable of covering structures in a relatively short period of time. Such an event would have had immediate consequences for any settlement in its path. If water rose quickly enough, entire sections of the city could have been rendered uninhabitable in a matter of days or even hours. Yet the absence of widespread structural collapse in some layers suggests that while flooding may have occurred, it was not necessarily uniform across the entire settlement. Instead, it may have affected different zones at different times, creating a patchwork of destruction and survival. This complexity makes reconstruction difficult. There is no single moment of catastrophe clearly visible in the record. Instead, there are multiple disruptions, each leaving partial traces. This raises the possibility that the city's decline or transformation was not caused by one defining event, but by a sequence of environmental pressures that gradually reshaped its viability. As excavation continues, evidence of water-related adaptation becomes more pronounced. Channels cut into sediment appear in some layers, though their purpose remains uncertain. They may have been attempts at drainage, irrigation, or flood control. Their alignment suggests intentional design rather than natural formation. If so, they represent early engineering responses to environmental instability. Even in the face of repeated disruption, inhabitants appear to have tried to manage water rather than simply abandon the site. Nearby, changes in soil composition hint at controlled modification of the landscape. Certain areas show signs of compaction and levelling inconsistent with natural processes. These modifications suggest that the inhabitants may have reshaped their environment in response to recurring water challenges, possibly attempting to stabilize living conditions through gradual intervention. Still, despite these efforts, the pattern of interruption continues. Some habitation layers end abruptly beneath flood deposits, while others show gradual abandonment followed by reoccupation. This uneven pattern suggests that resilience varied across time and space within the settlement. Certain areas may have been more vulnerable than others, depending on elevation, proximity to water channels, or structural design. In one deeper excavation zone, a particularly dense flood layer reveals a concentration of displaced material. Stones, fragments of walls, and mixed debris are embedded within a chaotic sediment matrix. The arrangement suggests violent movement, consistent with high-energy water flow capable of transporting structural elements over short distances. Yet even here, there is no evidence of total destruction across the entire site. This partial preservation creates an unusual situation. The city does not appear to have been erased in a single moment. Instead, it seems to have been repeatedly damaged, partially buried, and then partially rebuilt. Over time, these cycles accumulate, each leaving behind a different version of the settlement. The result is not a simple narrative of rise and fall, but a layered sequence of persistence under pressure. And yet, the deeper question remains unresolved. What caused these environmental shifts? Were they regional climate cycles? long-term hydrological changes, or something more abrupt and localized. The evidence supports multiple interpretations but does not allow a definitive answer. Each explanation accounts for part of the pattern, but none fully explains the repetition and variability observed in the stratigraphy. As the excavation moves toward even deeper layers, the sense of uncertainty increases. The city is no longer just a human construction buried by time. It is becoming a point of intersection between human adaptation and environmental volatility, a place where survival was repeatedly negotiated with forces beyond control. And beneath these layers of disruption and return, the earliest foundations still wait, holding whatever original conditions first allowed human presence to take root in a landscape that has since been transformed beyond recognition. The excavation reaches a level where the usual clarity of archaeological interpretation begins to blur. Layers no longer separate cleanly into distinct phases of occupation and abandonment. Instead, the soil presents a compressed continuity, where traces of human life and environmental disturbance are so interwoven that distinguishing cause from effect becomes increasingly difficult. Here, the most revealing evidence is not architectural but behavioral. Across several zones, artifacts are found in positions that suggest abrupt interruption of activity. Tools lie unfinished. Grinding surfaces are abandoned mid-use. Storage pits contain partial contents, as if they were never fully emptied or filled. These details create a subtle but persistent impression. Daily life did not always end in an orderly way. In some moments, it appears to have been cut short. The interpretation remains cautious, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. This is not the slow fading of a declining settlement. It is the repeated freezing of activity at different points in time. In other areas, the opposite pattern appears. Some spaces show evidence of clearing and reuse, where older materials were deliberately removed and replaced with new surfaces. These zones suggest recovery phases, moments when the settlement was actively reoccupied and restructured after earlier disruption. The alternation between interruption and renewal becomes one of the defining characteristics of the site. It is no longer a simple question of whether the city was occupied continuously or abandoned. It appears to have experienced both conditions repeatedly, in cycles that may have extended across centuries or longer. Within this complex pattern, human presence begins to feel less like a continuous occupation and more like a series of returns to a familiar place. A place that remained important even after being damaged, buried, or partially erased. One of the most striking discoveries in this layer comes from a cluster of domestic remains near what may have been a central pathway. Here, the sediment preserves traces of food preparation areas, including hearth-like features and charred residues embedded in compacted soil. The distribution suggests repeated use over time, not a single occupation event. Yet above these features, a distinct flood deposit interrupts the sequence, sealing the area under a layer of mixed sediment and displaced material. The sharpness of this boundary is significant. It suggests that at least one major environmental event occurred quickly enough to halt activity and cover occupied spaces without allowing gradual decay or dismantling. However, the lack of uniform destruction across the broader site again complicates interpretation. Some nearby areas remain relatively intact, indicating that the event was uneven in impact. This unevenness becomes a recurring theme. As excavation expands laterally, differences in preservation become more pronounced. Certain sections of the settlement appear deeply buried under thick sediment layers, while others show thinner coverage or partial exposure. This variation suggests that topography played a crucial role in how environmental forces affected the city. Slight differences in elevation or proximity to water channels may have determined whether a structure was submerged, damaged, or preserved. Within these variations, researchers begin to reconstruct a more dynamic picture of the ancient landscape. It was not uniform terrain, but a complex environment shaped by water movement, seasonal fluctuation, and long-term geological change. The city existed within this shifting system, adapting to it, suffering from it, and occasionally being reshaped by it. Yet adaptation has limits. Evidence from deeper layers suggests that at certain points, environmental stress may have exceeded the capacity of local adjustment. Sediment deposits become thicker and more chaotic, indicating stronger or more frequent inundation events. In some cases, these deposits are directly associated with abandoned habitation zones, suggesting that entire sections of the settlement may have been temporarily or permanently vacated. What is unclear is whether these abandonments were localized or widespread. There is no single layer that indicates total and permanent evacuation of the entire site. Instead, abandonment appears fragmented, affecting different zones at different times. This creates a patchwork of occupation and absence, where life persists in some areas while others fall silent beneath accumulating sediment. One of the more subtle but important findings in this layer involves changes in construction technique over time. In earlier phases, building methods appear more varied, with greater inconsistency in stone size and placement. In later reoccupation phases, construction becomes more uniform and efficient. This suggests that knowledge was preserved and refined rather than lost. Even after disruptive events, the returning populations or their successors appear to have retained architectural understanding, possibly passing down techniques across generations. This continuity of knowledge stands in contrast to the physical instability of the environment. It suggests that while the land was unpredictable, human adaptation remained persistent. Skills were not erased by disruption, even when structures were elsewhere in the excavation. Faint traces of symbolic activity begin to appear more frequently. Incised markings on stone fragments, patterns of repeated engraving, and the careful placement of certain objects in non-utilitarian contexts suggest that meaning-making played a role in this society. The exact nature of these symbols remains unknown, but their consistency implies shared understanding within the community. However, no fully readable system of writing has been identified. This absence leaves a significant gap in interpretation. Without textual records, the social and cultural structure of the settlement must be inferred entirely from material remains. This limits certainty, but increases the importance of spatial and environmental evidence. As the excavation deepens, another pattern becomes more apparent: the relationship between disruption layers and symbolic traces. In some cases, symbolic or carefully arranged objects appear directly above or below flood deposits. This could indicate ritual responses to environmental events, or simply the preservation of cultural materials within disturbed contexts. Either way, it suggests that environmental change and human meaning-making were closely intertwined in the lived experience of this settlement. Toward the end of this section, attention shifts again to the lowest exposed layers. Here, the density of artifacts decreases, but their significance increases. Objects become fewer, but more deliberate in placement. Structural remains are less complex but still clearly intentional. It is as if the settlement is approaching its earliest identifiable phase, where human presence is just beginning to leave a sustained mark on the landscape. And beneath even this level, deeper strata remains sealed. Layers that may represent the earliest occupation, or possibly the first moments when human activity began to transform this environment into something that could eventually support a settlement of such scale and complexity. The city is no longer just being uncovered. It is being traced backward into its own origin. At this depth, the excavation changes character again in a way that is almost imperceptible at first, but impossible to ignore once recognized. The soil becomes quieter, not in sound, but in content. There are fewer artifacts, fewer structural fragments, fewer of the dense material signatures that define the upper layers. Instead, this sediment takes on a more uniform composition, as if the intense cycles of building, flooding, and rebuilding above had finally given way to something simpler, earlier and less disturbed. Yet simplicity here does not mean absence of complexity. It means a different kind of record. The stratigraphy shows long, uninterrupted stretches of deposition with minimal human interference, interrupted only occasionally by faint traces of activity. These traces are subtle, a scattered stone, a lightly altered patch of soil, a fragment too small to immediately identify as cultural or natural. It is in these faint signals that the earliest human presence begins to emerge, not as a fully formed settlement, but as a gradual imprint on the landscape. What becomes clear is that occupation at this level is no longer continuous in the way seen above. It is intermittent. Small clusters of activity appear, separated by expanses of apparently undisturbed ground. These clusters suggest short-term habitation events rather than permanent settlement. Early groups may have returned to this location repeatedly, but not yet established the dense, structured urban environment seen in later layers. Instead, the land appears to have been used, abandoned, and revisited across long spans of time. This pattern shifts the interpretation of the entire site. Rather than a single city that gradually developed and collapsed, what is emerging is a much longer trajectory of human interaction with a specific place, one that may have begun with seasonal or temporary occupation long before any permanent structures were built. In this earliest phase, the environment appears markedly different. Pollen analysis indicates a richer ecological system, with plant species suggesting wetter conditions and more stable vegetation cover. Animal remains, where present, point to a diverse ecosystem capable of supporting both small and medium-sized fauna. This would have made the region attractive for early human groups, likely drawn by predictable resources and seasonal abundance. But even in this relatively favourable environment, there are signs of instability. Sediment layers show periodic shifts in water flow patterns, with evidence of both flooding and drying cycles. These fluctuations would have created a dynamic landscape, one that required constant adaptation from any groups attempting to use it. The absence of permanent structures in the earliest layers may reflect this instability, an environment that supported life, but not yet permanence. Within these sparse occupation traces, the first recognizable human modifications begin to appear. Small stone arrangements, likely related to tool production or basic shelter construction, are found in scattered clusters. These are not organized structures in any architectural sense, but they do show intention. Stones are selected, placed, and sometimes shaped, suggesting early cognitive planning and spatial awareness. Fire-related traces appear as well, though inconsistently preserved, indicating controlled use of heat in specific locations. These activities are not yet urban. They are not even fully settled in the conventional sense. They represent something earlier repeated human return to a meaningful location within the landscape. A place remembered, even before it is built upon. One of the most important observations in this layer is the lack of large-scale structural continuity. Unlike the upper layers, where architecture forms a coherent system across space, here there is fragmentation. No clear street patterns, no aligned walls, no consistent building orientation. Instead, each occupation cluster appears slightly different in placement and structure, suggesting independent episodes rather than coordinated urban planning. And yet, despite this fragmentation, the repeated return to the same region is unmistakable. Something about this place consistently draws human groups back. It may be resource availability, it may be geographic positioning, it may be something more subtle, such as seasonal water access or ecological diversity. Whatever the reason, it is strong enough to create a long-term pattern of reoccupation that spans far beyond any single cultural phase. As excavation continues downward, another layer of complexity appears. Between occupation clusters, there are zones of complete absence of cultural material that are unusually long in duration. These sterile intervals suggest extended periods when the site was not used at all. This reinforces the idea of episodic rather than continuous habitation. The land was not always occupied, but it was never fully forgotten. Then, in the deepest exposed section of this phase, a subtle but significant shift occurs. Soil composition begins to change in a way that suggests increased human influence even in these earlier stages. Slight compaction patterns indicate repeated foot traffic in certain areas. Microdebris clusters suggest processing activities that may have been more systematic than previously thought. These details hint that even before permanent settlement, there may have been repeated organized activity at this location, possibly seasonal gathering or coordinated resource use. This challenges the assumption that complexity only emerges after permanent settlement begins. Instead, it suggests that the foundations of later urban development may have been laid during these early, intermittent phases of occupation. Memory of place, repeated return, and gradual environmental familiarity may have created the conditions for eventual permanent settlement. And beneath this earliest detectable human presence, the ground continues downward into a level where even these faint traces begin to disappear. The sediment becomes increasingly uniform, less shaped by human presence and more by natural processes alone. Yet even here, the possibility remains that somewhere below, the very first encounter between humans and this landscape is still recorded in ways too subtle to yet interpret. The city, as it will later be known, has not fully begun yet, but its story is already being written in the soil. The excavation now sits at a threshold where interpretation becomes less about structures and more about forces. The deeper layers no longer present a clear distinction between human activity and environmental change. Instead, both appear intertwined, each shaping the other in ways that are difficult to separate after so many millennia of compression and transformation. At this stage, the site stops behaving like a city and starts behaving like a question. What exactly caused the repeated cycles of occupation, disruption, and return? The upper layers showed complexity, organization, and repeated rebuilding. The lower layers revealed intermittent use and gradual emergence of settlement behavior. But between these phases lies the most difficult problem: the interruptions. Not just one, but multiple breaks in continuity, each marked by sedimentary changes that suggest environmental stress. These interruptions are the focus of competing interpretations. One of the most widely discussed explanations centers on hydrological instability. The evidence for this is substantial but not definitive. Flood deposits appear repeatedly across different depths, sometimes thin and diffuse, other times dense and chaotic. These layers suggest that water played a significant role in shaping the settlement's history. However, the inconsistency in timing and intensity makes it unlikely that a single flood event was responsible for the observed pattern. Instead, what emerges is a picture of recurring water-related disturbance. Seasonal flooding, shifting river channels, and episodic high-energy water events may have repeatedly altered the habitability of the region. Each time conditions changed, Parts of the settlement were abandoned or damaged, only to be reoccupied later when stability returned. This would explain the alternating layers of occupation and sterile sediment observed throughout the excavation. But water alone does not fully account for the complexity of the pattern. Another interpretation considers longer-term climatic variability. Changes in regional temperature and precipitation cycles could have gradually altered the environment over centuries. A shift from wetter to drier conditions or vice versa would have profound effects on vegetation, resource availability, and settlement sustainability. In this model, the city's history is not defined by sudden catastrophe, but by slow environmental pressure punctuated by episodic stress events. Yet even this explanation struggles to account for the abruptness seen in some stratigraphic boundaries. Certain layers show sharp transitions between occupation and sterile sediment, with little intermediate degradation. These boundaries suggest rapid change rather than gradual decline. The question is whether these represent extreme climatic events, localized disasters, or something more complex involving both natural and human factors. A smaller but persistent line of interpretation considers tectonic activity. While direct evidence of major seismic disruption is limited within the immediate settlement layers, subtle indicators exist: slight shifts in structural alignment, localized collapse patterns, and irregular sediment intrusion could be consistent with ground movement. However, the evidence is indirect and not strong enough to support a singular seismic explanation for the repeated interruptions across the entire site. As a result, no single theory fully resolves the pattern. Instead, the most cautious interpretation is that multiple overlapping processes were at work: hydrological changes, climatic variability, and possibly localized geological instability. Each may have contributed at different times, producing a complex environmental backdrop against which human occupation repeatedly rose and fell. Within this uncertainty, one observation becomes increasingly important. Despite repeated disruption, human groups consistently return to this location. This persistence suggests that the site held value beyond its immediate environmental risks. That value could have been practical access to water, fertile land, or strategic positioning, or it could have been cultural, tied to memory, identity, or tradition. The archaeological record cannot distinguish between these possibilities directly, but the pattern of repeated reoccupation strongly implies that abandoning the site was never permanent. Even after significant disturbance, the people came back. This behavior introduces a deeper layer to the interpretation of the settlement's history. It was not simply a passive victim of environmental forces, it was also a chosen place, repeatedly re-engaged with despite its instability. In some sections of the excavation, evidence begins to suggest that knowledge of past events may have influenced later rebuilding. Structural adaptations in upper layers appear more efficient in water management, as though later inhabitants had learned from earlier disruptions. Drainage channels, elevated foundations, and reinforced walls suggest attempts to mitigate the same risks that had previously damaged the settlement. This raises the possibility of cultural memory extending across generations. Not written history, but transmitted experience knowledge of where to build, where to avoid, and how to adapt. Even without textual records, the persistence of certain architectural responses suggests that information about environmental behavior was retained and applied over long periods. Yet despite these adaptations, the interruptions never fully disappear. Even in later phases of occupation, the pattern of disruption and return continues, albeit with increased resilience. The city never becomes fully stable in the way seen in later, more well-documented ancient urban centres. Instead, it remains structurally adaptive, constantly negotiating with an environment that refuses to settle into predictability. As excavation deepens further, attention shifts once again toward the earliest confirmed occupation layers. Here, the evidence becomes increasingly fragmentary. Cultural material is sparse, and what remains is heavily influenced by natural processes. Still, even in this sparse record, the repeated human presence is unmistakable. Small groups return to this place over long periods, leaving behind traces of activity that slowly accumulated into the foundation of something larger. Not a city yet, but a pattern of return, adaptation, interruption, and re-engagement with a landscape that both supported and resisted human permanence. And beneath this pattern, still deeper layers remain, where the first conditions of this relationship between people and place begin to take shape. At this depth, the excavation reveals something that changes the tone of interpretation again. The earlier layers suggested repeated occupation and environmental disruption, but here the remains begin to show signs of deliberate spatial consistency. Even in their fragmented state, the structures align in ways that feel too coordinated to be incidental. Stone foundations emerge with clearer organization. Walls are no longer scattered or irregularly oriented. Instead, they begin to follow repeating alignments, forming enclosed spaces that suggest planned usage rather than improvised shelter. The difference is subtle compared to later, more developed architecture, but it is unmistakable when viewed across multiple excavation points. There is an emerging logic to space. What is most striking is that this coherence appears at a depth earlier than expected for such structural behavior. The settlement is no longer just a collection of occupation events. It is beginning to resemble a system. Within this system, certain zones stand out due to their structural density. These areas contain thicker walls, more durable foundations, and evidence of repeated reinforcement over time. The consistency suggests that these were not temporary constructions but long-term focal points within the settlement. Their function remains uncertain, but their durability implies importance possibly communal, possibly environmental, or possibly tied to coordination of group activity. Between these denser zones, more open areas appear, where structural remains are lighter and more dispersed. These spaces may have served as pathways, gathering areas, or transitional zones. The repetition of this spatial arrangement across different excavation sections suggests an underlying organizational principle rather than random settlement spread. Even without written language or formal maps, the settlement appears to follow a recognizable internal structure. Yet the most important discovery in this layer is not architectural consistency, but the gradual emergence of hierarchy in space. Some areas show significantly more activity than others. Artifact concentration is uneven, with certain zones containing dense accumulations of tools, debris, and structural remnants, while others remain relatively sparse. This suggests that different areas of the settlement had different roles, whether functional, social, or environmental. The idea of a fully uniform early settlement becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Instead, what is emerging is a differentiated landscape of human activity, where space is organized according to use, repetition, and perhaps social structure. Still, caution remains essential. These interpretations are based on material distribution, not direct evidence of social organization. The risk of overreading spatial patterns is well known in archaeology, and researchers remain careful not to impose modern concepts onto ancient behavior. However, the consistency of the patterns across multiple layers makes them difficult to dismiss entirely. As excavation continues, additional complexity emerges in construction techniques. Walls in this layer show improved stability compared to earlier phases. Stones are more carefully selected and arranged, with fewer irregular gaps. Binding materials appear more consistently applied, suggesting either improved technique or accumulated knowledge. In some cases, foundations are embedded deeper into the soil, indicating a better understanding of structural support and long-term durability. This suggests that construction knowledge was not static. It evolved over time, likely through repeated trial, error, and adaptation to environmental conditions. The presence of rebuilding and reinforcement in earlier layers supports this idea. Each generation appears to have inherited not only the location of the settlement, but also the accumulated experience of how to maintain it. Within this architectural progression, another subtle but important pattern emerges. Certain structural orientations remain consistent across layers, even when other aspects change. This suggests adherence to spatial conventions that persist over long periods. Whether these orientations are practical, environmental, or symbolic remains unclear, but their stability implies continuity of cultural practice. At the same time, evidence of environmental pressure remains present even in this more organized phase. Sediment layers still show periodic disruptions, though they appear less catastrophic than in deeper or earlier phases. Flood-related deposits are thinner, more controlled, suggesting either improved environmental management or shifts in regional hydrological behavior. The relationship between settlement and environment appears to be stabilizing, though never fully resolved. The settlement is adapting but not escaping its conditions. One particularly important observation comes from the relationship between built structures and natural landscape features. Some of the more stable constructions appear to align with subtle variations in terrain elevation. This suggests that builders may have begun to take advantage of natural topography to reduce environmental risk. Slightly elevated areas are more densely built, while lower-lying zones show fewer permanent structures. This indicates an increasing awareness of environmental behavior and a strategic response to it. Such adaptation marks an important stage in settlement development. It reflects not only survival, but learning. However, even in this more stable phase, the pattern of interruption does not disappear entirely. There are still signs of abandonment in certain zones, followed by later reoccupation. The cycle persists, though less dramatically than before. As excavation approaches the deepest layers of this structural phase, attention turns once again to what lies beneath. Here, the architecture begins to lose definition. Stones become less uniform, spatial organization more fragmented. Yet even in this reduced clarity, the sense of intentionality does not disappear. Instead, it becomes more difficult to interpret, as if the earliest builders were working within constraints that have not yet been fully understood. And below this level, the final transition toward the earliest detectable human presence begins to take shape. The point where organization itself first starts to emerge from a landscape that was once only intermittently touched by human activity. A place not yet fully a city, but no longer simply a temporary stop. A threshold between movement and permanence. At this depth, the excavation reaches a point where the material record begins to shift away from architecture and toward meaning. The structures are still present, but they are less dominant than before. What emerges more clearly now are the subtle traces left behind by repeated human intention that cannot be fully explained through function alone. The first indication of this shift comes from small, carefully arranged markings found on stone fragments scattered across multiple excavation zones. These are not random scratches or utilitarian tool marks. They appear deliberate, repeated, and in some cases standardized. Lines intersect in consistent patterns, Curves appear where straight edges would have sufficed for practical use. Some symbols are isolated, while others appear in sequences, as though they once formed part of a larger system of communication or expression. Yet no complete system survives intact. There is no continuous inscription, no preserved text, no single artifact that allows direct translation or decoding. Instead, there are fragments, pieces of a system that remains just out of reach. This absence creates a gap that cannot be easily filled, forcing interpretation to remain cautious and incomplete. What makes these markings more significant is their distribution. They do not appear randomly across the settlement. Instead, they cluster in specific contexts near structural thresholds, within enclosed spaces, and occasionally in association with objects that appear to have been deliberately placed rather than discarded. This suggests that the markings were not purely decorative or incidental. They likely carried meaning, even if that meaning is now inaccessible. In several instances, similar symbols appear across different layers separated by significant time gaps. This continuity implies that whatever system of marking existed was not a brief experiment, but something transmitted across generations. Even as construction techniques evolved and environmental conditions shifted, certain symbolic forms persisted. This persistence introduces an important possibility. Cultural continuity may have been stronger than the physical continuity of the settlement itself. While buildings were repeatedly damaged, rebuilt, and reconfigured, symbolic practices may have remained more stable. This suggests that identity, memory, or shared understanding within the population could have been maintained even through periods of disruption and environmental stress. Alongside these markings, another category of material becomes increasingly relevant: carefully shaped objects that do not show clear functional wear. These items are smaller, more refined, and often found in contexts that suggest intentional placement rather than disposal. Some are made of stone that has been worked more delicately than typical tools. Others incorporate pigments or surface treatments that serve no obvious practical purpose. Their presence suggests activities that extend beyond survival activities that may relate to identity, ritual, or social cohesion. However, it is important to remain cautious. Without direct interpretive evidence, assigning meaning to these objects remains speculative. They could represent specialized tools whose functions are not yet understood, or they could indeed reflect symbolic or ceremonial behavior. The archaeological record alone cannot fully resolve this distinction. What it does reveal, however, is complexity. This settlement was not solely defined by subsistence activity. There are clear indications of repeated behaviors that go beyond immediate survival needs, suggesting layers of social or cultural life that are not easily reconstructed. In some excavation zones, markings appear in contexts that are difficult to explain purely through utility. For example, symbols are found on surfaces that show minimal wear, suggesting they were not part of heavily used working areas. In other cases, similar markings are located near structural boundaries, as if they marked transitions or designated spaces within the settlement. These patterns raise the possibility that space itself may have been symbolically organized, not just functionally divided but conceptually structured. As excavation continues, the relationship between symbolic traces and environmental disruption becomes more apparent. In certain layers associated with flood deposits or structural abandonment, symbolic objects appear either preserved in situ or relocated by sediment movement. This repeated association suggests that environmental events and symbolic behavior were not separate domains in lived experience. They intersected, sometimes preserving, sometimes obscuring, but always interacting within the same material record. One of the more intriguing aspects of this layer is the repetition of symbol clusters across different architectural contexts. Even when building forms change, certain symbolic patterns reappear. This suggests that symbolic knowledge may have been less dependent on physical structures than on shared cultural memory. It also raises the possibility that different phases of occupation, even after disruption, were connected by more than just location. They may have shared underlying conceptual frameworks that persisted across time. Despite this, no definitive linguistic structure emerges. There is no evidence of grammar, no clear progression of written narrative, and no standardized script that allows for direct reading. The system, if it is a system, remains partial and fragmented. It sits somewhere between communication and expression, between marking and meaning, without fully resolving into either category. As deeper layers are reached, the frequency of these markings decreases slightly, but their significance appears to increase. They become rarer but more carefully placed. This suggests that symbolic activity may have been more selective in earlier phases, possibly reserved for specific contexts or purposes. Over time, it may have become more widespread or diversified, reflecting changes in social structure or cultural practice. Yet even in its earliest detectable forms, symbolic behavior is already present. This is a crucial point in understanding the site. The emergence of this settlement is not only architectural or environmental, it is also cognitive. The ability to assign meaning to objects, spaces, and arrangements appears to be present from relatively early stages of occupation, suggesting that cultural complexity developed alongside, not after, settlement formation. As the excavation approaches the boundary between structured occupation and the earliest human presence, the symbolic traces begin to thin once again, and beneath them lies the final transition zone, where meaning, structure, and environment begin to merge into their earliest indistinct forms, a place where the origins of this buried city are still only partially visible. The deeper layers no longer behave like a city slowly being uncovered. They behave more like a boundary being crossed. Each removed section of Earth reveals less about finished structures and more about beginnings, unfinished patterns of human presence that have not yet stabilized into anything recognizable as urban life. Here, the density of material drops again, but not evenly. Instead, it fluctuates in clusters, as if human activity in this phase was intermittent and highly sensitive to environmental conditions. Small concentrations of artifacts appear, then vanish for long stretches of sediment, only to reappear again in slightly different form. This irregular rhythm suggests a population moving through the landscape in repeated returns, rather than continuous occupation. What is becoming increasingly clear is that this place was never simply built in a single developmental arc. It was repeatedly approached, used, abandoned, and re-engaged over timespans that likely extend far beyond conventional settlement timelines. Within these earliest identifiable layers, the evidence of structural permanence becomes faint. Instead of walls or foundations, there are only partial arrangements of stone, shallow depressions in the soil, and areas of subtle compaction that suggest repeated human activity. These are not buildings in any stable sense. They're traces of behavior, brief moments when humans shape the ground before moving on again. Fire-related traces appear more frequently here, though they are inconsistent in form. Some are small and localized, suggesting short-term use. Others are slightly larger, indicating repeated occupation of the same spot. The distribution of these traces implies that fire was central to activity, possibly for warmth, cooking, or social gathering, but not yet organized into fixed domestic spaces. At this stage, the idea of a settlement begins to feel too rigid. What exists instead is a landscape of recurring human presence. One of the most important observations in this layer is the relationship between artifact clusters and natural features. Human traces are not randomly distributed. They consistently appear near subtle environmental advantages, slight elevations, dry ground patches, or areas that likely provided better visibility or access to resources. This suggests an early form of spatial awareness, where humans repeatedly selected favourable microenvironments within a broader, changing landscape. This pattern is significant because it predates any clear architectural system. It indicates that long before permanent structures existed, there was already a learned relationship between people and place. Knowledge of where to return, where to pause, and where conditions were most favourable appears to have been transmitted across generations, even without fixed buildings to anchor that knowledge. Yet the environment itself remains unstable. Sediment layers show continuing fluctuations in water influence. Some deposits suggest periods of relative dryness, while others indicate sudden influxes of water or sediment movement. These shifts would have made long-term occupation difficult, reinforcing the pattern of repeated return rather than continuous settlement. In several areas, erosion patterns suggest that earlier human activity may have been partially erased by later environmental events. This creates gaps in the record that are not due to absence of occupation, but to loss of evidence. The earliest phases of human presence here may have been far more extensive than what survives today. Still, even in this fragmentary state, certain behavioral consistencies emerge. Stone tools in these layers are simple but deliberate. They show consistent selection of material and repeated shaping techniques. While they lack the refinement seen in later phases, they demonstrate clear intentionality. These are not random fractures of rock, but early expressions of tool-making knowledge. The repetition of similar tool forms across different clusters suggests shared behavioral traditions, even if not yet formalized into standardized production systems. Another important feature is the recurrence of spatial reuse. Certain locations show repeated evidence of activity separated by long periods of inactivity. This suggests that human groups returned not only to the broader region, but to specific points within it. These points may have held environmental significance, such as reliable water access or favourable terrain, but they may also have held social or cultural importance that is no longer visible in the material record. The deeper implication is that memory of place existed long before permanent architecture. This memory may have been environmental, passed through observation and experience rather than recorded systems. It may have been embedded in seasonal movement patterns or oral traditions that left no direct trace. As excavation continues, the boundary between natural formation and human activity becomes increasingly difficult to define. Some soil disturbances could be the result of human behavior, but could also be explained by natural processes. In this layer, interpretation becomes more cautious than ever, as the evidence no longer clearly separates cultural from environmental origin. This ambiguity is not a weakness of the data, it is itself part of the story. It suggests a period when human impact on the landscape was still emerging, still negotiating its presence within broader ecological systems rather than dominating them. Toward the deepest exposed edge of this phase, a subtle shift begins to appear. The clustering of human traces becomes slightly more concentrated. Artifact density increases marginally. Spatial reuse becomes more frequent. These changes suggest that something is beginning to stabilize, not a full settlement yet, but a strengthening pattern of return that may eventually lead to permanent occupation. This is the threshold where movement begins to transform into persistence, where repeated presence begins to form the earliest outline of place. And beneath this threshold lies the final layer before the origin point of the buried city becomes fully obscured in geological time. The moment before permanence takes shape. At this final transition of the excavation, the earth changes in a way that is less about structure and more about absence. The deeper the trench extends, the fewer clear indicators remain of sustained human modification. Yet this absence is not empty. It is filled with faint, scattered evidence that suggests something in the process of becoming, rather than something already formed. The sediment here is older, more compact, and significantly more uniform than any layer above it. It reflects long periods of natural deposition with only occasional interruptions. These interruptions are subtle: a broken stone out of place, a patch of soil slightly altered in composition, or a faint concentration of organic residue that resists natural explanation. Each of these hints at brief human presence, but none form a continuous narrative on their own. Instead, they form fragments of episodes. Short visits, repeated returns, temporary occupation without permanence. At this stage, the concept of settlement begins to dissolve almost entirely. What remains is behavior-human movement through a landscape that has not yet been fully organized into the spatial logic of a city. The patterns suggest familiarity with the region, but not yet transformation of it. One of the most important shifts in this layer is the weakening of structural evidence. Where earlier phases showed even the faintest suggestion of walls or foundations, here there are only minimal ground disturbances. Slight depressions in soil may indicate temporary shelters or windbreaks, but nothing that persists with clarity across multiple excavation points. If structures existed, they were likely made of organic materials that have not survived, or they were too temporary to leave lasting impressions. This raises a crucial interpretive point. Permanence in archaeology is often a matter of preservation, not presence. The absence of architecture does not necessarily mean absence of habitation. It may reflect a stage of human adaptation where construction was still experimental, lightweight, and highly responsive to environmental conditions. Environmental evidence supports this interpretation. The landscape at this depth appears more variable than in later periods. Indicators suggest alternating phases of moisture and dryness, with vegetation patterns shifting accordingly. Such variability would have encouraged mobility, making permanent construction less viable or unnecessary. Human groups likely followed seasonal rhythms, adapting their presence to changing resource availability. In this context, repeated return becomes more significant than fixed settlement. Certain locations show subtle but consistent reoccupation markers. These include compacted soil patches, repeated fire traces, and localized concentrations of stone flakes. While each instance is small, their recurrence over time suggests that these points held lasting importance within broader movement patterns. This is where the idea of place begins to emerge more clearly. Not as a built environment, but as a remembered location within a landscape. The distinction is important. Place in this sense is not defined by structures but by repeated human engagement. It is shaped by memory, behavior, and environmental familiarity rather than permanent construction. At this level, there is also evidence of increased behavioral efficiency. Stone tools become slightly more standardized, though still simple. The selection of raw material appears more deliberate, suggesting knowledge of where suitable resources could be found. This indicates not only movement through the landscape, but understanding of it. The people associated with these traces were not simply passing through randomly. They were navigating a known environment, returning to familiar zones, and making repeated use of specific resources. Yet even with this growing familiarity, there is no clear evidence of long-term occupation. Instead, what emerges is a pattern of adaptive mobility. Groups appear to have moved through the region in cycles, likely following environmental cues, water availability, vegetation growth, and seasonal changes would have structured these movements. The settlement, as it will later become, does not yet exist in this phase. Only the conditions for its eventual emergence are present. One of the more subtle findings in this layer is the gradual increase in clustered activity over time. Earlier segments show isolated traces, widely separated in space and time. Later segments show more frequent clustering of activity in specific areas. This suggests a slow intensification of return behavior. Certain locations are being revisited more often, even if not yet permanently occupied. This intensification is critical. It represents the first measurable shift towards spatial preference strong enough to influence long-term behavioral patterns. Still, environmental instability continues to shape human decisions. Sediment evidence shows periodic disturbances that may correspond to flooding or erosion events. These disruptions likely force temporary relocation or abandonment of favoured sites. Yet the repeated return to the same general area suggests that the advantages of the location outweighed its risks. This balance between opportunity and instability defines the entire system at this stage. Neither environment nor human behaviour is dominant, both are in negotiation. As excavation approaches the lowest visible boundary of this phase, the traces of human activity become even more fragmented. There are moments where presence is almost entirely absent, followed by brief reappearances. These fluctuations suggest that the region was on the edge of sustained habitation but had not yet crossed into it. It is here that the most important transition begins to take shape. The repeated return to specific locations, the gradual accumulation of behavioral traces, and the increasing familiarity with the landscape all converge towards something new. Not yet a city, not yet even a settlement in the later sense, but a foundation of continuity forming within movement. And beneath this threshold lies the final point where human presence first begins to leave a lasting imprint strong enough to survive thousands of years of burial. The beginning of permanence, still barely visible. At this deepest confirmed layer of human trace, the excavation enters a space where interpretation must slow down almost completely. The material is no longer abundant enough to support confident reconstruction of full behaviours, yet it is not absent either. Instead, it exists in sparse, carefully spaced fragments that suggest human presence was real, but still fragile, still negotiating whether it would remain tied to this landscape or pass through it without leaving anything permanent behind. The soil here is older than any layer above it, compacted through immense pressure and time. It carries only faint signatures of disturbance. Unlike the structured complexity of later phases, or even the repeated clustering of earlier occupation zones, this level shows human activity in its most minimal form brief, isolated engagements with the environment that leave only partial traces. A few stone fragments appear with edges that are slightly modified, but not fully shaped into standardized tools. Their form suggests use, but not specialization. Nearby, small concentrations of charcoal indicate fire activity, though not in fixed hearth structures. These fires appear temporary, likely ignited for short-term needs before being abandoned or extinguished naturally. Nothing here indicates permanence, and yet nothing here indicates randomness either. The spatial distribution of these traces still follows subtle environmental logic. Activity clusters appear near areas that would have offered shelter from wind, access to water, or visibility across the surrounding terrain. Even at this earlier stage, human presence is not chaotic, it is selective. This selectivity is one of the most important findings in this layer. It suggests that even before permanent settlement existed, Humans were already reading the landscape in consistent ways. They recognized favorable conditions, returned to them, and used them repeatedly across time. These patterns may not yet constitute settlement, but they form the behavioral groundwork from which settlement will eventually emerge. Environmental data reinforces this interpretation. The landscape at this depth appears more dynamic than in later periods. Evidence suggests shifting moisture levels, variable vegetation coverage, and fluctuating resource availability. These conditions would have required mobility as a survival strategy. Groups likely moved frequently, following seasonal cycles or resource availability rather than remaining in fixed locations. But within this mobility, there are still points of return. Certain areas show repeated but non-continuous traces of human presence. These are not sustained occupations, but revisitations. The same locations are used again after long intervals of absence. This pattern suggests that knowledge of place persisted even without permanent occupation. This is a crucial distinction. It implies that memory of landscape existed independently of architecture or infrastructure. The land itself functioned as a form of cognitive map, guiding repeated movement across generations. At this stage, however, there is still no evidence of built environment in any stable form. No foundations, no structured enclosure, no organized spatial divisions. Only temporary modifications of the ground, which vanish almost completely over time unless preserved by unusual conditions. Yet even in this minimal record, one pattern becomes increasingly important. The frequency of return to certain microlocations increases slightly over time within this layer. While still irregular, there is a detectable trend toward repeated use of specific zones. This suggests the beginning of spatial preference strong enough to influence long-term behavior. It is not yet settlement, but it is no longer purely random movement either. It is the early formation of attachment to place. This attachment may have been driven by practical factors, water access, food availability, shelter conditions, but it may also reflect social or cognitive patterns that encourage return to familiar locations rather than constant exploration of new terrain. The archaeological record cannot fully distinguish between these motivations. What it can show is repetition. And repetition, here, is the seed of permanence. Another important feature of this layer is the absence of clear destruction events. Unlike upper layers, where flooding and disruption are repeatedly visible, this deepest phase shows fewer clear indicators of sudden environmental catastrophe. Instead, change appears gradual and diffuse. This may suggest that earlier periods were less volatile, or simply that the resolution of the record is too limited to detect sharper events. Either way, the environment at this stage does not appear to be the primary driver of interruption. Instead, mobility itself defines the rhythm of presence and absence. Human groups arrive, use the landscape briefly, and leave again. Over long spans of time, these repeated interactions begin to accumulate faintly in the soil. Not as structures, but as tendencies. As the excavation approaches the lowest boundary of detectable human influence, even these tendencies begin to fade. The traces become fewer, more isolated, and more difficult to interpret with certainty. There are moments where the line between human and natural origin becomes almost indistinguishable. But even here, a final pattern remains visible. Human presence, however minimal, consistently returns to this specific region. Not continuously, not permanently, but repeatedly enough that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence. This repetition is the final thread connecting mobility to eventual settlement. It suggests that long before the city existed, long before architecture or structured space emerged, there was already a relationship forming between people and this landscape fragile, intermittent, but persistent across time. And beneath this fragile relationship lies the final threshold, where repetition will eventually become continuity, and continuity will eventually become permanence. The point where the buried city begins its true existence, still hidden just beyond reach. At the lowest accessible boundary of the excavation, the Earth no longer behaves like a record of human activity. It behaves like a transition zone where human presence is only just beginning to leave a stable imprint. The traces are faint, widely spaced, and separated by long intervals of apparently untouched sediment. Yet even in this sparsity, there is a quiet persistence that refuses to disappear entirely. This is where the buried city stops being a structure and becomes a beginning. The soil here shows long periods of natural deposition with only occasional disturbances. These disturbances are small but deliberate, a scattered concentration of flakes from stone shaping, a faint burn layer, or a slight compaction of earth that suggests repeated passage. None of these features form buildings, streets, or any recognizable settlement pattern. Instead, they suggest episodes of brief human engagements with a landscape that is still largely wild, still unorganized by permanent construction. What matters most in this layer is not what is built, but what is repeated. Certain points in the landscape show signs of being visited more than once. These locations are not marked by structures, but by subtle changes in soil density and material distribution. A patch of ground may show evidence of fire use, then remain untouched for a long period, only to show similar traces again much later. This repetition suggests that early human groups were not randomly moving through the region, but were returning to specific places that held consistent value. The reasons for these returns cannot be fully reconstructed. They may relate to water sources that shifted over time, seasonal vegetation patterns, or advantageous terrain features that remained stable even as the broader environment changed. Whatever the cause, the effect is clear. Certain locations within this landscape were repeatedly selected, even without permanent occupation. This repeated selection is the most important behavioral signature at this depth. It marks the transition from movement through space to recognition of place. Even in the absence of architecture, the landscape is no longer neutral. It is being remembered through use. Stone fragments from this layer show early stages of shaping, though not yet standardized tool production. Edges are worked, but inconsistently. Some pieces appear to have been used and discarded quickly, while others show signs of longer use. This variation suggests a period of experimentation or flexible tool behavior, where function was immediate and adaptation was constant. Fire traces appear intermittently as well, but without fixed hearth structures. Instead, they are scattered, suggesting temporary use in open spaces rather than designated domestic zones. This reinforces the idea that human presence here was short-term and mobile, rather than settled. Environmental indicators suggest a landscape in flux. Vegetation patterns appear variable, with periods of greater density followed by thinner coverage. Water availability likely shifted over time, influencing where and when groups could remain in the area. These conditions would have made permanent settlement difficult, reinforcing cycles of movement and return. Yet despite these constraints, the repetition of presence continues. It is this repetition that slowly begins to transform the relationship between humans and the land, not through construction, not through planning, but through memory embedded in behavior. Over long periods, repeated visits to the same locations begin to create a pattern in the landscape itself. Even without buildings, these places accumulate meaning through use. They become familiar points in a wider territory, gradually forming the earliest framework of spatial continuity. This is the quiet origin of permanence. Not a sudden decision to build, but a slow convergence of behavior towards specific points in space. As excavation approaches its deepest limits, the traces of human activity become increasingly minimal. There are moments where only the faintest indications remain: a single flake of stone, a subtle soil disturbance, a trace of burning that could be natural or human in origin. Interpretation here becomes uncertain, but the pattern of recurrence across space and time still suggests presence. Then, beneath even these faint traces, the record fades. Natural sediment dominates. Human influence becomes indistinguishable from background geological processes. The landscape at this level exists before the city, before settlement, before even the clear recognition of place as something consistently inhabited. And yet, the evidence above this threshold makes one thing clear: the buried city did not begin as a city. It began as repetition. A return, then another return, and another, until eventually those returns stopped being temporary, until the land was no longer just visited but held. From that slow accumulation of presence, the first true structures would later rise, layer upon layer, until time itself sealed them away. What remains today is not only a city buried for 9,000 years, it is the long memory of how a place becomes permanent in the first place. As the excavation closes on this deepest boundary, the earth below remains unbroken, still holding whatever earlier origins lie beyond the reach of current discovery. Above it, layers of human history continue upward, collapsed, rebuilt, flooded, and reformed until they finally disappear into the modern surface. And somewhere between those extremes, the buried city continues to exist in two forms at once: as stone beneath the earth, and as the long echo of repeated human return across forgotten time.